Welcome. My name is Philip Martin. I'm Senior Investigative Reporter at the GBH Center for Investigative Reporting, and I'm today's moderator. Joining me today, besides yourselves, of course, are Damian Hooper Campbell. He's the Chief Diversity Officer at Zoom. All of us use it now. Joan Steinberg, Managing Director and Global Head of Philanthropy at Morgan Stanley and President of the Morgan Stanley Foundation. Linda Akutagawa, President and CEO of the Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics, and Sarah Vinson, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, founder of the Loria Psych Group and Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Pediatrics at the Morehouse School of Medicine. Extraordinary panel we have here today. Damian, Joan, and Linda are all members of the Steve Fund's Crisis Response Task Force formed to address the particular impacts and vulnerabilities of the pandemic and other factors on the mental health and emotional well-being of young people of color. Now, like many events, this particular one is presented in partnership with the Steve Fund and jointly with GBH News. We're streaming live online right now on the platforms of the Forum, GBH News, and The World from PRX and GBH. We're also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. Viewers can email questions to the forum at hsph.harvard.edu. The forum at hsph.harvard.edu. I don't think it's any mystery that the COVID-19 pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on people of color, with significant mental health consequences. We're seeing it all over the place. Young people of color face specific vulnerabilities that we're going to discuss during this important conversation. Now, if you adjust for age, the mortality rates for Blacks, Latinos, and Indigenous people are 3 times higher than those for whites. I'm going to repeat that because that's so important. Mortality rates for Blacks, Latinos, and Indigenous people are 3 times higher than those for whites. And because states aren't consistent in the way they report data on Indigenous people and Pacific Islanders, often lumping them together with other groups, the actual rates could be even higher for these populations. Now, people of color are also being hit especially hard by the economic impact of the pandemic. You can see it from Detroit to Dallas, to Baltimore to Boston. And when the shutdown began, unemployment shot up for everyone. But for some groups like Black workers, it's hit especially hard, as we've seen. As of August, the unemployment rate for Black youth stood at about 25%, more than twice what it was at the same time last year. The pandemic is also taking a serious toll on the mental health of people of color. Now, according to the CDC, 30% of Black and 35% of Hispanic people polled together reported experiencing symptoms of trauma and stress-related disorders like PTSD as a result of the pandemic. At the same time, the United States is going through a racial reckoning, catalyzed by the killing of George Floyd, putting American racism and anti-racism front and center on the national stage. The question, as much as the statement, is Black Lives Matter? For young people of color entering the workforce or those trying to advance their careers, all of these issues are being layered on top of the existing challenges of being a person of color in the workplace. So today, we're going to look at what employers can do to support young people of color during the pandemic and beyond. Let's start with a clip, which is courtesy of the Steve Fund.
The experience of, trying to attain some kind of success in this country, in this cultural environment, has shown me so much about what power and privilege looks like here. And the idea that you're supposed to hustle, you're supposed to fight for yourself to the top, and that there's a particular way you're supposed to do it. One way you're supposed to look like, one way you're supposed to act like, how you're supposed to think like, even the goals you're going for. Like, those things are all hidden and unspoken. And I didn't come from that world. I didn't know what any of the rules were. I felt like I banged myself up on the way of learning what it takes.
So Damien, let's talk about what Ginny just said as a young person of color who's outside of the system and the mental health challenge that poses. From your perspective, what are the issues that young people like Ginny face, and how can employers best support them, especially now during the pandemic when a lot of folks are working from home?
Sure. Philip, thank you for having me, and thanks to all the organizations. And thank you for using Zoom. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. That said, what Jenny has articulated is quite common, right? We've seen this in some of the research in the Steve Fund report, as well as anecdotally, that there are oftentimes feelings of imposter syndrome, feelings of isolation, feeling like, hey, is there a different set of rules that I'm not actually privy to? And the reality is that inside of corporations, depending on who is in a seat of influence and who is actually a true culture carrier and the people who are setting the rules in the organization, they may be totally oblivious to some of these different experiences that young people like Jenny are having. And so, my recommendation, and I think, all of us as panelists in some of the research that is out there agree that the future of work says that corporations, if they want to remain competitive at getting top students like Jenny, who may acknowledge the fact that there's a different experience for other people, they have to run towards this conversation and acknowledge that there is no one size fits all when it comes to experiences. They've got to run towards having the sticky, tough conversations around the relationship between mental health and productivity and how that differs for people of color. Another thing I would say quickly, Philip, is that if this is going to be very real, corporations have to reevaluate their definitions of success and the profiles that they are raising, whether it's on their career sites or when they are recruiting virtually. What are you telling young people of color success is at your organization, both in who's in the top ranks, but also who they are engaging with? And again, just overall definitions of success that are there. And then the last thing I would say is that many corporations and people who may be in positions of leadership, they just don't know. And so I would encourage them to get proximate and to do the due diligence on their own, either working with many of the organizations that are represented today or on their own. Google's an amazing tool where you can research some of these things and just get a better understanding for the kinds of experiences that people like Jenny are having so they can build that empathetic muscle.
That's the other thing about Zoom. We always have to remember to unmute.
You're not alone,
So,
Philip.
exactly. So, so Damien, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Let's turn to Joan. Joan, most mental health problems start early in life. So, why is the transition to the workplace one of those critical times? And how should companies be thinking about the well being of young people of color?
I'm really glad you asked this because we're talking a little bit of how the pandemic has really laid bare some of these things, but some of them have been truths forever. And one of them is that most mental health problems start pretty young in people's lives, about half by early teen years and about half by mid 20s. And I think it's important, and I'm sure Dr. Vincent will back me up on this, that the young person's development, they're not quite done. We think of young people in college as adults, but they're not quite developing. And so these are actually critical times in terms of mental illness. But change is also really hard on people. It's hard on everyone. And I think there's been a lot of work from high school to college and looking at what was happening to young people's mental health, and not so much on the college to career. But that's a huge transition. And for young people of color, it may be a transition from what felt like a safe space into an environment where, like Jenny, they're not sure of the culture, or frankly, it doesn't look like them and they're not sure where they're going to fit in. And so it might restart all of the imposter issues, isolation issues. And again, that's not about COVID. That's just life. COVID has just exacerbated it, which it tends to do with everything. So I think for companies, we've made a shift from sort of diversity to inclusion to equity. And inclusion means that your employees need to come and feel like they can be their authentic selves, because only then are you going to hear their voices. Are they going to be a part of the contribution? Is it going to create an environment where everybody's valued? And so I think this is a natural shift for companies to think about the mental health of their young people as a way to ensure that you're creating a safe space for them to come in and be a part of who you are. And I know we're going to talk more about this, but to us with Morgan Stanley and our alliance, that's something we're really focused on, is how do you make sure that corporations are a part of the stigma reduction and a part of the resource delivery to make sure that you both are welcoming people and giving them the tools they need to be safe and healthy in your environment.
Well stated, indeed. Imposter syndrome. We'll talk about that some more as well. Let's turn to Linda. Linda, as president of LEAP, you're focused on enabling Asian and Pacific Islanders to take on leadership positions at work. So tell us more about some of the culturally specific mental health findings of the task force and some of the barriers to well-being specifically facing Asian and Pacific Islanders right now.
Thanks so much, Philip, and thank you to the Steve Fund and all of the organizers also of this important conversation. And I just really resonated with what Damien and Joan were both saying, especially about the imposter syndrome. Couple of things that I guess I'll just mention is that in terms of some of the challenges facing Asian and Pacific Islanders, specifically Asian Americans right now, is the idea of the COVID-19 related hate crimes, the xenophobia that is being perpetrated also on Asian Americans. It just adds to what's already a stressful kind of situation. And I believe that it comes out in the form of xenophobia for Asian Americans, but I would say for other people of color in general, I think there are other forms of this kind of discrimination that is being perpetrated upon people who are different. I think in terms of just some of the culturally specific kind of recommendations, I think there are a number in the Steve Fund report, but I just want to really, I think, elevate or uplift some of the recommendations that I think would help not only just Asian Americans, but all people of color. And I think the idea, one is about being able to create these kind of environments where they have trusted and safe spaces where they can talk with either peers or a trusted, whether it's in the school, like an administrator, or at work, a trusted manager. I think those kind of examples are really important in being able to give people who may be struggling with a place where they can at least share it with somebody. I think that's the most important thing. If you don't have a chance to share it, you're just kind of like taking it all in, and before you know it, and I know that this may come up later, but it's not only just the explosions that can happen in terms of behavior, but my personal experience is that some people just cannot deal with it any longer, and they feel like their only way out is to take their life. And so I think for me, this is very personal in the sense that I've had that experience, and I just would never want that to happen to anybody. I'd much rather have them have a chance to get help somewhere from someone that they trust.
Speaking from experience, extraordinary. Let's turn to Sarah. This is a natural transition, in fact, because as a psychiatrist, tell us about the kind of stressors that Black people are experiencing, both in the wake of COVID and the wake of the death of George Floyd. And as Linda was just talking about, in terms of the broad sense of racist assaults and attacks that are occurring in the country on Asian Americans. That, of course, is also being experienced by Black Americans, resulting in racial unrest across the country. How does this affect young people in the workplace? And And how does it affect their mental health specifically?
So everyone is on a continuum between mental illness and mental health. And where they go on that continuum is dependent on the stressors that they are experiencing, and the way that they cope with those stressors and the things that are available to them in terms of coping. And people can cope in ways that are adaptive, so in ways that in the long term work out for you, and in ways that are maladaptive. And what we've seen in 2020 is that stressors for people of color have gone up, whether it is disparate impacts of COVID or unemployment or financial insecurity, or even just knowing people in your family, in your community who are dealing with these things. Well, at the same time, people's coping mechanisms have been taken away. So things like travel, vacation, getting your massages, like all of these things that people normally incorporate into their lives have been taken away at a time when they really need them most. And there's this sort of collective compartmentalization we do in the American society where we are the land of the free, home of the brave, liberty and justice for all, while at the same time, the reality of what this country is founded upon, the gross inequities that are present in every system are always there. So we sort of have to put those in a box in order to be part of this narrative about what America is and is supposed to be. And I think one of the things that's happened with 2020 is it has busted all of those compartments wide open, right? We can't pretend anymore the way that we have as a nation about sort of what we are, the inequities that persist, and the racism that is present in the healthcare system, which is what we've seen with COVID, and in the carceral system, which is what we've seen with George Floyd and with the many other people whose deaths have been highly publicized.
This is an extraordinary summary. Let's turn now to let's think about these insights and what we've just heard, and just sort of take it in for a second, because I think what we want to do now is have a chance to take a deeper look at these issues and some of the changes that can help workplaces support the mental health and the careers of people of color. Now, before we do that, we have another clip. This is a clip of a young woman of color. Her name is Joanne, who is not only working, but also taking classes and has a disability. Let's hear what she says about the type of supports that are helpful. This clip is courtesy of the Steve Fund.
I'm first generation and I have a disability. Nobody understands what it is to wake up at 6 in the morning, go to work until 9, go to class, and then go back to work. The students I sit next to don't understand that. Administrators need to understand that not all of us come from the same walk of life, and they need to see how they can meet us halfway. Every program I've been in, all the leadership has been super supportive, thank God. It makes me feel really validated, and it feels good. It feels good to have people supportive of my voice and of my condition.
Okay, heard from Joanne. Before we begin the next part of our discussion, I just want to remind folks that this is the forum at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, presented in partnership with the Steve Fund and jointly with GBH News. Viewers can email questions for the panelists to the forum at hsph.harvard.edu. The forum at hsph.harvard.edu. So the Steve Fund, our partner today, recently convened a crisis response task force that made some specific recommendations about how workplaces can support people of color. One of these recommendations has to do with supporting internships that will help bridge the transition from college to career. Joanne, the woman we just saw in the clip, is juggling both worlds. But obviously, most internships are going to have to look different than they look right now. People need to get paid. So Damien, what is the landscape right now for internships? And on a related note, how does mentorship fit?
Yeah, Philip, this is personally and professionally important to me. I started disclosing to employers only in 2014 that I am diagnosed with ADHD and take medication for it every single day. It wasn't something that I ever told employers when I was an intern, because as Joanne mentioned in the clip, people didn't understand. I didn't think they would understand. So personally, it's important to me. Professionally, as Zoom's first chief diversity officer, I also have ownership over our university recruiting team and building that out. And so everything that Joanne mentioned is spot on. When you look at some of the research out there that is also in the Steve Fund report, it's very clear that students of color in particular have a much harder time securing paid internships than do their majority peers in terms of race and ethnicity. And in fact, in a recent review of over 42,000 internship opportunities, paid internship opportunities at the top 200 companies, 6% went to African Americans and 4% went to Latino students. And so the landscape's a little dire, right? And this does get down to access. It gets down to differences in walks of life and all of those things, but also confidence. And so I think a couple of things to highlight from the report as actionable things that companies should be thinking about. Number one is really in the role modeling. And what we mean by this is, the more you can get leaders from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life to get together and to share personal and vulnerable stories with whether it's students they're trying to recruit or students or candidates who have just graduated and are now transitioning into the workplace, the better. Because what it does is it erodes this kind of facade of perfection and helps these students to understand, oh, these folks maybe had some bumps in the road. These folks might have ADHD. And now all of a sudden that stigma that Linda mentioned earlier is lowered, right? And you can begin to have more direct and human conversations. The other thing is a speaker series. One of the things that we've been doing at Zoom that you can see in my virtual background is our Race in the Workplace speaker series, which is a 9-part session that tackles things like mental health and the different experiences that people of color have and what companies should be doing. And these speaker series that really keep this conversation going, they're not only great for educating people, for giving people of color, young people of color in the organization a voice and representation in kind of a third-party way, but now more than ever, young people of color are paying attention and making decisions on who they want to work for based on whether or not a company is being real. Is a company just putting a black box out there and making financial commitments to all of what's going on right now, or are they really investing in this? And so again, I think the mentoring aspect is really important, and that can come through role modeling, having these intimate conversations that help to increase confidence, but also through other initiatives and programs like a speaker series that address some of these really tough topics.
I'm intrigued also, of course, by the fact that you said this was personal, that you experienced this. And let me also ask, is the Race and Work place, is that symposium available to the public?
It is. Thank you, Philip, for calling that out. It's on time.com. There'll be 9 sessions. I believe 8 of them are up now. And for anybody who's trying to have this conversation but may not have the resources or know where to start, in addition to the report from the Steve Fund and all of the different resources that these organizations that are here today represent, we'd love it if you go ahead and leverage those resources as well.
Right,
Thanks, Philip.
Damien, thank you very much. While we're talking about building relationships, mentors, of course, are in a good position to notice if individuals whom they are mentoring are struggling and need some extra support. So Sarah, as employers are trying to support employees who may be having a particularly hard time, especially now, what specific risk factors for young people of color in the workplace should employers know about, and what factors can make the work environment itself risky?
Something that's really important when it comes to risk factors is thinking about things on a population or a community level. So one of the problems with medicalization or with creating a diagnosis for things is that it places the pathology or the problem in an individual, and it also places the responsibility for fixing it in an individual. But when you're talking about things that are affecting certain groups at 3 times higher rates, that's not an individual issue, that's a community issue, that's a population issue. So rather than looking at your individual employees, thinking about the stressors that they may experience just by virtue of the categories they fit in American society. So if they are first generation, if they are a first generation college student or graduate student, if they are a person of color at a time when you know that people of color are disproportionately impacted, something as seemingly small as if you're from a community where 3 times more people are getting COVID, you're more likely to be sending money to somebody in your family who is laid off, or somebody in your family who may have gotten sick and doesn't get paid time off. That's something that I ended up doing that my white coworkers may not be doing, right? And so just understanding that it's not about, does this person look like this individual is having trouble coping and they may be a little anxious, but understanding that they are facing extraordinary stressors, and being sure to try to have their support match their stressors, and not framing it as a short failing of that person or a pathology of that individual.
Well, following up on that, Sarah, we've heard a bit about the importance of the need for leaders to look at things through both a trauma-informed lens and an intersectional lens. Tell us more about what that means and how leaders can put it into practice.
So with intersectionality, we're really encouraging people to step away from this sort of cookbook cultural competency approach, which is, we have our stuff for women and we have our stuff for Black people and we have our stuff for Asian people and we have our day, right? That this is something that becomes part of how the company operates, and you understand that Lean In resonated with a lot of white women. There are a lot of Black women it didn't resonate with in the same way, right? And so thinking about the fact that it's not just one box, but that each person brings these different categories and that there's interplay between them. And so treating each employee as an N of one, and finding ways to get to know them, and then support them in a way that makes sense for them from an intersectionality standpoint. And then when it comes to being trauma informed, just being mindful of the traumas that people may bring into the workplace. So trauma at a very basic level is something that undermines people's sense of safety and security in the world. And there's a way that, yes, watching George Floyd, watching his death resonated with the American public, but it resonated with people who saw George Floyd and saw their uncle, their father, their son, their brother in an entirely different way. And understanding that, even things like missing work after something like that happens, there are studies that show Black people are more likely to have days off of work because it is so stressful. So thinking about not just the things that are relevant in your community, which may be gated and majority white and have a lot of college educated folks, but that are relevant and pertinent in the communities that your employees are coming from.
You raised something which also makes me think also about the privileges that come with where we work and how we work. Some folks are right now flipping hamburgers and serving as security guards and exposed to COVID in ways that many others aren't. It's a question for Damien, because I'm thinking about the whole notion of the remote workplace. As leaders are trying to recognize aspects of their workplace and the culture that needs to change, many are also doing so in this radically different remote environment. Damien, what are some of the opportunities that remote work presents? And what are some things that employers need to watch out for when they're not in the same room, for example?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question, Philip. And I wish we had more time to run through all the opportunities that are there. But I want to caveat this by saying, as Dr. Vincent mentioned, there are different experiences that people are having where sometimes they don't have the ability to work remote. But for those people who do, who are in environments where they can work remote, there are lots of opportunities. Let me give you a couple of concrete examples. Prior to kind of everyone working remote, if you had folks who were in the office, majority of them were live in the office, and then there were a couple of people who were already working remote, maybe because they were taking care of an elderly, parent or had something else to do. The people who are sitting in that room, when you jump on to that video conference, they're chit-chatting, they're having a good time, they are building relationships, and you see that. And for anybody who remembers before we were all working from home and working remotely, it was really hard to get a word in edgewise if you were one of only two people who were on that video and everybody else was in a conference room in person. And so, like no other time before, us all working remotely and using platforms like Zoom, it means a couple of things. It means, number one, we're all equal in terms of the way that we show up. In fact, as I'm looking at these rectangles, we're all the same size. It also means that there are multiple ways for us to engage in a conversation. For folks like myself, who typically are more extroverted, I usually have no problem speaking up. But for other people who maybe spend more time processing or who may be dealing with some imposter syndrome, especially when you have young people who are just coming into the workforce, and then on top of that are people of color and may not see a lot of people who look like them, well, you can use the video, to actually use your audio and speak, or you can use a chat function in most cases if you're a bit more introverted and you still want to get your thought across, which is fantastic. On top of that, Philip, as we think about, different features around accessibility, we've all talked about being a young person who's transitioning in the middle of COVID, a young person who is also of color. And then to Dr. Vinson's points around intersectionality, imagine now you're a young person who is a person of color who also may have low vision, right? Or who may be deaf or who may be blind. The accessibility features that are possible with platforms like Zoom are extremely inclusive, and that's done intentionally. And so I think that there are lots of wonderful opportunities, but we got to be careful because there's also some challenges. I right now have a virtual background. Again, Dr. Vince, I keep going back to you because you're making so many great points. But you talked a bit about differences in socioeconomic experiences. For some people who may be working from home and don't have a background, right, that they're proud of in terms of their home. For some people who may have a spouse or young children in the background and don't want to show that, we have to be careful to give people creative expression to actually use a background when they'd like to, and sometimes not. The other thing, and the last thing I'll say is a watch out, is at some point, my fingers are crossed on this and my prayers are up, Philip, but at some point, we're going to go back to the workplace. And it's my guess that we won't all go back, that there'll be a hybrid situation. Now, we all may be giving each other equal treatment with these equal rectangles and different ways to engage and talk through chat and audio. But when we go back, if we don't keep that muscle memory of inclusion that platforms like Zoom have offered and working from home offered, then guess what? We're going to go right back to where we were before, where young people of color in particular, who may be working remotely, will not be able to build the relationships, or will have a harder time building relationships because they're not in person, where some of their peers may be in the office and may be in person. And so the watch out here, Philip, is enjoy all of the aspects of inclusive collaboration that working from home currently provides, but be really intentional and proactive about acknowledging the disparities that will be created when we go to a hybrid workplace.
Really intriguing frame of of assumption. I appreciate that, Damien. But I also think when there's inclusion, yes, in the context of these squares, but I also think about isolation. And I want to talk to Joan and Linda about this. The isolation that occurs when you're working from home. I mean, there's a certain freedom, obviously, but there's also an extraordinary isolation that occurs outside of the corporate environment and or a nonprofit environment or a school environment. And the young people probably more than others are experiencing. And Linda, Joan, if you would weigh in on that, I would certainly appreciate it.
Well, I'll try to get started here. I mean, I think when we look at the mental health of young people, isolation is going to be a stressor. And I think that we've all seen that the sort of lockdowns that have been caused by COVID and the separation from peers and the inability to connect with people is really hard. To bring it back to the workplace and to some of the internship experiences that Damon was talking about, if you were lucky enough to have been able to keep your internship, and that's a big piece of discussion we should have, you may not have been given the opportunities to make the kinds of connections that you would have otherwise. And I think for young people of color, this is particularly trying because they may already be minority in that space. They weren't the biggest part of that workforce. They may not know the other kids that were in their internship program, and now they're stuck on a screen, and that may have been their only connection. And I think trying to absorb the culture of an environment you're walking into through is this a 3x2 box? That's a really difficult space to do it in. And I just wanted to jump on something that Dr. Vincent said, and as a white person on this panel, to emphasize that I think one of the learning things for corporations as we're trying to address this is that for so many of us, the racial trauma has not been our experience. And I think intellectually we can understand that, but we need to be honest that we don't get it. Like, it's not something that we innately understand. We may have had our own otherness experiences, religious, sexual orientation, but we need to be really thoughtful and careful that we absorb that. And I don't think it's young people's place to tell us that so that we understand it. I think that is on us to do our own work on and to make sure that our environments are safe as people are coming into it. So I'm sorry, I veered a little away from the question.
No, I'm really happy you addressed that because it's something I wanted to get raised with both Sarah and to Linda. Because I'm thinking about this. When you think about polling at the very beginning of the summer, just think about it. There's heightened awareness of the role of race on the streets, and then, of course, by inference on the workplace. But as we've moved along, fewer and fewer people, based on polling, seem to accept that this is an extraordinary form of trauma. And we're back for many people to the whole notion of it's all about individual responsibility as opposed to something systemic. So I'm just wondering, and for young people where they felt perhaps they had an anchor at the very beginning of the summer, if someone understands, now they may be feeling, wow, we're back where we started. And how do you deal with that? A young person's mental health is challenged to an extraordinary degree by that. And I'm just wondering, Linda, if you would start, and then Sarah, if you would pick up on that.
Thanks so much. So one, I will say that I think it, the whole saying about it takes a village, I do believe in that. I think it requires all of us to be both mindful and vigilant about ensuring and reassuring young people, but anybody we're working with or that we may be interacting with, that this is not something that just goes away easily. I also want to make a couple other connections, if I can, to this idea of trauma. One of the things that I think oftentimes may not be understood, but could be triggered by the racial trauma that we're seeing, there's two perspectives. One is, as I think about in communities where there's a significant refugee population. I'm thinking about, like, in the Asian community, there's a lot of Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodian, and Lao who, came over here as refugees and were subjected to genocide. The trauma that the families that then also pass that on to their kids, I think also get further triggered by a lot of what we're seeing, not in the same way, but just these ideas that people are being attacked, that they're being vilified. And then also when you think about refugees from Latin America, where they're being subjected to some of the killing, armies and other things that we're seeing from like El Salvador and Guatemala. And I mean, I'm just thinking the kind of the incredible pressure that not only are Black American youth being faced with on an everyday basis, but now these other things are also being exacerbated also for others that may not even be understood because those are stories that are oftentimes not told. So I wanted to just mention that. I'm also going to say within my own organization, I would just say that I think for those that I work with, for those that I interact with outside of my own organizations, people who feel deeply about the issues around race and ensuring systemic change, I've also seen that they too are feeling a lot of the kind of stressors that others are also feeling as well too. And I think it's also then becomes incumbent on employers to also take steps to try to help support, I think, the mental health issues, or it's not really an issue per se that they are mentally ill, but these stressors do take tolls on all of us. I think it's important that we, especially in this remote work environment as well too, now coming back to the isolation part, I think as employers, as managers, as leaders, we need to find ways in which we can keep people connected through Zoom, through other means, even if it's just to say, you know what, let's have a weekly check-in, and we don't want to talk about work. We just want to talk about fun things, do something different where we can just make people feel like at least for that, whatever time frame that we have, we're just connected and being human beings, and also to consider too, you know, give people time off if they need that. You know, that mental health break. That's what I've done at my organization, because I've realized that, you know what, we can't all just expect that people are just going to be working as if business as usual is just, you know, what it is for all of us. So.
Linda, Phil, if it's okay, if I can
Please,
jump on that.
please, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things I'd like to add. So number one is that the business community has a huge capability that's not currently being used to reduce stigma around mental health issues. It's a powerful voice to be able to say, we all got this, like everyone is dealing with this, and to make mindfulness and other things you can do to reduce stress like a normal part of the offerings. And they have a financial opportunity to actually invest, not only for their own employees, but actually in the community, because the number of people who are struggling with issues and have no access to care is just too high. And so I raise that just to say that there's great opportunity here to make a difference. And then I would only note that I think really large corporations are already implementing some of these things because they have the staff and they have the financing. But I think for smaller companies, and we had talked about this as a panel, but when you look at the number of people employed by small businesses, they don't have those resources. So a philanthropic investment into communities to ensure that those resources are available writ large, I think that's really critical for us to do as a sector to make sure that the rest of our sector is getting held up. I hope that makes sense.
Well, you actually answered one of the questions I was going to ask you, so that's great. And also a question that came in from one of the viewers, and we're going to turn to that. I think there's a necessity for some elaboration, so we'll turn back to that in a few minutes. Sarah, you were going to say, however, I think in trying to connect the dots that have just been thrown out here.
Yeah, so, and we've brought up imposter syndrome a few times, and I just wanted to quickly say what that is. So in a society where the picture of success is often white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, if you're some other category and you're walking down the halls of your organization seeing all the people who are honored on the walls and none of them look like you, right? As you start to find success or move forward, even though you're defying those odds, it's hard for you to believe that it's real. So you start to come up with this explanation for how this is what success looks like. This is how I look and it's not the same. How did this happen? And sometimes the explanation we come up with is everybody made a mistake. So the people who let me into undergrad made a mistake. The people who let me into grad school made a mistake. The people who hired me made a mistake. The people who promoted me made a mistake. I'm really not supposed to be here. And any day, somebody's going to figure out that I'm an imposter. That's imposter syndrome. And we know that it disproportionately impacts people who don't look like the folks on the walls and on the statues and all of those things. And there's a way that workplaces, mentors, sponsors, managers can help to mitigate that, right? So something that's really important if you don't come from a family where you have the connections from the country club is to get mentorship around the culture of the workplace in America, right? Because you didn't have that sort of growing up. That wasn't something that was accessible to you. So giving people clear feedback giving them concrete steps around things to do, being intentional about overcoming your affinity bias to mentor people who you naturally relate to, and taking the steps to mentor people who you don't naturally relate to, are all things that are really important because they help that person who may be feeling othered feel more safe and secure in the work environment, and helps them understand that, yes, I know who you are, I see what you can do, and you are, in fact, supposed to be here.
Thank you very much, Sarah. In fact, I suggest all of us, like focus and think about this notion a lot in depth, the notion of imposter syndrome. Only thing I could think of, what came to mind for me was the movie Get Out. When you mentioned it, Sarah. But on a serious note, we have some questions coming in, and let me see if I can. Let's see. Well, let's start with the first one here. And this again, Joan, I think this is directed at you primarily. What can corporate leaders do to encourage more intentional ways of reaching out to young people to reduce stress and anxiety around finding work?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of things, and again, the size of the corporation may matter here. I think clearly culturally, and and talk to any CEO, they'll tell you one of the most critical factors to the success of their business is the culture. So are you making sure that it's an inclusive culture? And I don't mean inclusive like diversity and inclusion. I mean literally an inclusive culture where someone's authentic self can come to work, where there's acceptance, where your differences are celebrated instead of shushed, where you're not trying to create a homogenous environment. So I think that that's a critical place. And that's where senior voices can really be helpful. You need to have a lot of input from the field, but you still need that senior voice making that acceptable. I think the resources you provide for employees, particularly around mental health, do you have world-class mental health care for your employees? One of the things the Steve Fund Task Force identified was having culturally relevant providers. Do the people who are helping you look like you, do you feel connected to them? Does this all work for you? The reduction of stigma in the environment where, I kind of talk about this as it's a no big deal, big deal thing. The no big deal is mental health affects everyone. It is not, it should not be shameful if you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed or having difficulty, but it's a big deal because, particularly in kids, about 2/3 of kids who are exhibiting symptoms won't get care. So it's a huge deal that people need to pay attention to and ensure that there's resources available. These are all things that people can actually deliver in the private sector. And then the daily things, it used to be, 10 years ago, as a woman in the workplace, I would always get the work-life balance question. And hysterically, while we're on this call, my son is marching into my bedroom. So if you saw me talking, I'm trying to shut him up. But now the conversation isn't how are you balancing work and parenthood? Now I'm getting questions all the time, how do you calm yourself down? What is freaking you out? How are you dealing with that? And I'm talking about mindfulness and yoga and running and things that no one asked a few years ago. I think that's great. How do we get that? How do we amp that up and make it even more? And then how does the corporation give you the time to do that, right? How do you take that hour in the middle of the day to take your yoga class and not have somebody feel like, why weren't you at the desk? Why weren't you answering my call? So I think there's a lot that corporations can do. And as I mentioned before, I think it's really critical that big corporations like Morgan Stanley get out there publicly around this stigma and resources issue. This is not anything that someone should ever delay getting help for if they have the means. And then the means are critical. How do we invest in our communities to make sure that people in the have-not category can access the same kind of care that someone at our firm can, right? Those are critical to us. And I think, the more companies on the large end who can deliver on that, the easier it'll be on those small businesses to be able to also care for their employees.
Well, it's clearly destigmatizing mental health issues is it's such an important topic. And it would seem that a lot of young people today even recognize this. According to a 2019 poll by the American Psychiatric Association, 62% of people ages 20 to 37 feel totally fine discussing their mental health at work, compared with only half as many people ages 54 to 72. But Sarah, I'm wondering if that's also true for people of color, kids of color, that same recognition.
I do think we are seeing improved recognition in communities of color as well. but there is the fear of double stigma that can come with that. And there's also the increased structural barriers that those young people face. So with double stigma, if you're in a society that's already racist, you have one mark against you when you walk into the workplace. And so the idea of having this mark and also the stigma of having a mental illness can seem like too much. And so people really want to avoid that because they already have one thing that has the potential to other them. But sometimes in the discussion, there's a lot of focus on stigma and people of color not wanting to get help. There's less discussion around the fact that our healthcare system actually doesn't serve people of color well, that it is not accessible to them, that it does not engage them, that it does not retain them, that it does not give them evidence-based care, that they don't get the same treatment outcomes that other people get. And so there's a piece of this that is structural, but is often talked about in cultural terms. So people talk about ethnic mistrust. Well, the system's not trustworthy for people who aren't white and have money. And so there's a conversation that has to be had about that. And just as by way of example, if you actually ask people, why don't you get mental health care? Black people don't say stigma, they say it costs too much. That's the answer they give you. And so it's important to think about both sides of those equations, that there's the fear of double stigma, but also the system's not as accessible to people of color.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm gonna turn back to our questions from our audience in a second, but Linda, I'm just wondering, how can we talk about mental health in the workplace without stigma and while respecting employees' privacy?
Actually, that's a really interesting question. And to your earlier point about young people being much more open about their mental health conditions or their struggles, I'll just share a personal story. So my organization, we do an annual summer internship program. And I will say that I'm one of those that always just assume most people just don't want to talk about it, especially in the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And this was about maybe 3 years ago. One of my staff said, the conversations are changing amongst the interns. They're being much, much more open about their mental health struggles. And one of the concerns is about how do we address, or how do we at least be prepared that if we need to provide some type of support, whether it's a referral or just even recognizing when something might happen, how do we as a staff be better prepared? And that's something that we've continued to discuss and to try to address. But in each year that's followed, what we're finding is that students are much, much more open about it. And I think, one of the ways to just, I think, destigmatize it is just treat it like as normal of a conversation and just say, how can I help? How can I support? Just like if somebody had said, I have cancer or I have this other condition, I think we just need to be able to just try to make it as, I don't want to minimize it by saying make it matter of fact, but I think if we try to say, oh my God, you're mentally ill, then that just makes it even worse, right? So let's just treat it like any other illness that I think anybody would face, and just say, how can I be of support? How can I help? What do you need? And I think that's a starting place for me, I think, in terms of what I would suggest to anybody. If I can also just say one more thing about what was said earlier about businesses having these resources. One of the things that I also want to note is that, what COVID has done for a lot of small businesses is put a lot of economic pressure on small businesses. So being able to take time off to get that yoga class, or let me just do my breathing exercises, or whatever it is that one may do to really try to achieve mindfulness, may not always be a luxury, especially, and I'm going to just say this affects everybody at every level of the organization. I do believe that leaders are just really trying to hold it together as best as they can too. And I think there's some role modeling that we all need to do, but it's hard when we're telling everybody else, take the time off that you need, but we're not doing it ourselves because, you know what, if I don't call that client back, that means I don't have business, and that impacts, a loss of one client could be huge to a small business versus like a larger company where they have more resources, more people to take care and jump in. And so I just want to also, just add that to the conversation that the COVID effect is really real, in the sense that unless there's resources, financial resources available to support small businesses, we're going to see this problem become even larger, not better for all people.
Okay, Linda, thank you very much. We have some questions, quite a few actually, from our audience. I'm going to read two in a row. So let's see how many we can grab as quickly as possible. The first question here is, has the woke culture helped young people of color in the workplace, or are there downsides? That's the first one. Whoever wants to grab that can grab that. And then the second one, think about this one too. Can you talk about the stress of even preparing a resume when you are a young person of color? Audit studies show bias in resume reviews by employers, where names that suggest a person of color has applied tend to be overlooked. So please, whoever would like to, go ahead, Damien.
Yeah, so the woke culture, there are upsides and there are downsides. The upsides are many, in that it has become trendy for people to be quote unquote woke, which de facto means that at the very least, people are going to be paying attention a little bit more and getting educated a little bit more. Now, the drivers behind that, I'm not really as much concerned with. It's just that people are trying to educate themselves a bit more. So I think that there's a clear upside there. I think that there can be a downside, in that as people describe themselves, especially people in maybe majority groups, describe themselves as woke, there is a level of comfort they may have with speaking about topics and not having the sensitivity that is probably necessary. And so when I feel like I'm woke and I can just say this and yeah, of course, and stand up for this, you haven't really done the due diligence, I think, in actually engaging and getting proximate with the individuals who you may be being woke on behalf of, to know that allyship and your best attempt at being woke is actually a comfortable moment for folks. And so I think being woke is a thing, but it has to be in context of the reality of what people are going through. I also think that there's an aspect of wokeness when it becomes overly trendy per se, and it's not done in an authentic way, where there's some blowback to that, right? So you are seeing across workplaces, as people become more woke, others are becoming, I think, a bit more convicted in the opposite side of that, and in saying, well, I don't want to hear about that. I don't want to talk about race in the workplace, or I stand firm in my beliefs about X, Y, and Z. And so there's now a new necessity, I think, to be able to be inclusive of folks who may not agree with this woke culture, but at the same time, supporting this piece. And on the resume side, that research is all true, right? We see it all the time. And this gets back to, I think, something that was said by Sarah, which was about, it's not just the individual that we need to be thinking about, but corporations should be acknowledging the resume test that you just mentioned, right? That certain resumes that may have more ethnic sounding names as they've been described, versus others that may be from seemingly majority or white communities. Same content, right, on the resume, but 50% more callbacks for the name that seems like it's of the majority. Well, corporations should acknowledge that and do some A/B testing around redacting information from resumes that includes removing names, includes removing where someone went to school or where they live. You can make it visible later on in the process, but on the front end, give some of those folks, an opportunity. And the last thing I'd say on the resume piece and on all of this onboarding pieces, the mentorship is so important. And I want to double click on the fact that mentors, in many cases, people do want to see people who look like them. But for those of you who are watching, who may not self-identify as people of color, and you have your own imposter syndrome about whether or not it's okay for you to be a mentor to someone who is a person of color or someone who is different than you, I implore you, get out of your own way. These young people need you. You don't need to identify on race or ethnicity. Identify on the fact that you both like watching a certain television show, or you both were horrible at sports, or you both were nerds in certain subjects. Identify and connect with people as human beings, and I guarantee you, you won't have to worry as much about the imposter syndrome that you may have, but these young people need you.
Okay, our time, of course, is running out fast. I'm wondering if someone, thank you, Damien, I appreciate it. I'm wondering if someone can answer this question very quickly. It's one you're going to hear quite a bit, but I think it's an important question. How can students already saddled with debt take on unpaid intern positions? Someone asks, and those of you who have that experience, what's your response to that?
Can I take that one? I'd like
Please.
to just offer a different kind of idea, because thank you. So one of the things that I think about, when people look at me, they just assume, okay, I'm an Asian American woman. I probably have multiple degrees. My parents probably have multiple degrees. And most likely I may be an immigrant, possibly not. I'll just say that I was the first in my family to get a bachelor's degree. And I went to a school that is considered I guess, a commuter school, because students like me, I went to class, I went to work, I went back to class, went back to work. And I think about students like me and others like me at the school that I went to, and we don't oftentimes have the luxury of taking an internship, even if it's slightly paid, if it's not making or getting us paid the same amount that I'm getting paid at my job, even though for me, I was working retail. I looked at some of the internships and I thought, there's no way I could take this, because I'll make more money working retail than I would taking this other internship with this quote unquote stipend. And I think that that's a challenge. And so one of the things that I would just challenge any company, any organization, is let's think differently about what internships could be. And the past couple years, my organization has tried out something that we call a classroom edition internship. So we give a similar internship experience where they're getting some work experience working on projects as they would in a kind of a classroom way, but also having access to mentors and other people and getting development as well too. And I think there are different ways that all of us can think creatively about how do we give those experiences where then students can put an internship on their resume. Because to the resume question earlier, when you look at certain students, if all their listing is retail jobs and no internships, you know who's going to get the job? The kid with the internship, because people don't value kids with retail jobs because they had to work, because they had to do that to be able to support themselves and their families. And frankly, I would rather have the kid with the retail jobs because I know that they know how to work. So I do want to just say that. And I think those are some of the other biases that I think we need to challenge ourselves to think about as well too. And I will also just lastly say, for all kids of color, for all people of color who are trying to get into, a workplace, a lot of us are, I think, working with this idea of being as perfect as we can be, because we know that we have the cards stacked against us. And so when I look at kids of color, I'm thinking, I'm sure that they're working with this kind of idea of perfectionism that underpins this imposter syndrome. And they're trying their hardest to try to be perfect. And that adds mental stress and greater, of a mental burden on all of them, because what if they don't live up to being as perfect as they can be because they have to work 2 times, 3 times harder than someone else?
Linda, thank you very much. And let me say to our audience today, I want to thank you for tuning in. But before we go, I'd like to ask our panelists to leave our viewers with one key takeaway from today's discussion in any order that you'd like. Please, just one key takeaway.
I'll go first.
Please.
For companies, be a safe space and create a safe space for others.
Excellent. Sarah?
So for the young people of color who are watching, just be reminded that the world needs you well, and there are things that are in your control, which can be hard to remember when so much is going the other direction. So sleep sounds simple, but it's huge. Get some movement in. I won't say exercise, but movement, and find your community.
Very good. Damien?
For all of the leaders who are out there, there's no way for you to be a good teacher to young people of color unless you yourself have gotten educated. So educate yourself not only on their experiences, but also use your company's resources so that then you can talk from first person experience about how valuable they are, and you can help to lower the stigma for so many in your organization who need you.
Excellent. Linda?
I'll just say for the young people, don't try to keep it all in. Share it, ask for help. Even if you're not sure it's something that you might need help on, just share it. For the companies and for the leaders out there, reach out, and I'm just going to use the word belonging. Help everybody feel like they belong.
I have to tell you, this has been a fantastic discussion. I want to thank you, Linda. I want to thank you, Joan, Damien, and Sarah. And of course, everyone who's been working in the background. That includes Lisa and Stevie and Patrick, GBH captioning, everyone, Christina, everyone. Thank you very much. This concludes this event, but not this important discussion, folks. Join us again next week when we will explore innovating on campus, supporting mental health of students of color during COVID-19 and beyond. That's on October 27th at noon. And also don't forget to visit forum hsph.org for more information. My name is Philip Martin. Thank you very much.